What role do you think media exposure plays in these cases, and how do you balance media exposure again with client privacy? I mean, I'm assuming any journalist worth their salt knows how to respect John Doe, Jane Doe, but I guess tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's a very important point. First and foremost, anytime you have a child sexual abuse case, you have this intersection, this crossroads where you have the publicity of abuse, hoping to alert other victims, coming into the path of the privacy of the victims. And there's going to be a collision course. Now, when that collision happens, you always have to come out on the side of privacy. Privacy always prevails. The proper journalist, as you said, a journalist worth his salt, will always protect the privacy of the victim. And I've had litigation, MG versus Time Warner, a published decision by the U.S. or excuse me, a published decision by the California Supreme Court, MG versus Time Warner, established a child sexual abuse victim's right to privacy, even when the case is publicly covered and there's public prosecution, the victim has a right to privacy. And so it's super important that you get publicity generally about a perpetrator committing acts against victims, kids, but the identity of the kids is irrelevant. You don't need to know it was little Johnny Smith or Susie Johnson who was the victim. That's irrelevant. What the public needs to know is that the perpetrator and his or her name, that perpetrator was out there abusing kids in this circumstance. And so if you are one of the kids, or if your child or a loved one is one of the kids who went to that school, who played in that league, who attended that hospital or that institution, they should be aware that there are other victims. And that this perpetrator, let's identify the perpetrator, because he's a convicted felon now. He's out there and he didn't just victimize one or two or three. He may have victimized hundreds or even thousands.
So what does the interplay look like then? You wouldn't do any kind of publicity before the case was decided. Um, Trying to think how I want to phrase this to make it make sense in the best possible way, most distinctly possible. I guess A, how do you balance the publicity with potentials for appeals? Is there ever a potential for appeal, or is it once they're convicted, they've admitted and it's just over? And then what happens when people raise their hand and say, yeah, that happened to me as well? Is that a whole nother round of different lawsuits? And who is that targeted at? I mean, I'm sure in one sense it's targeted at the perpetrator, but it's usually going to be targeted, I would assume, at the institution.
Yeah, so it could be both. First of all, I'm a believer in everyone's constitutional right to a defense. So no one is guilty until they're convicted in
Mhm.
court, or they plead guilty and they're convicted, either convicted by jury, convicted by a plea. But once they're convicted, and certainly, yes, they have a right to appeal. But once they're convicted, then you have a convicted criminal, you have someone convicted of abuse. Then the question becomes, is this criminal case for which this perpetrator was convicted, is this the only case? Or, which is much more common, were there other victims out there? And more often than not, as I said, I've never met the first victim. There
Yeah.
are. And so when they hear the publicity related to the conviction, then you often have other victims come forward. So I try to, because of my sensitivity to the privacy rights of my clients, of my survivors, I'm not a huge practitioner of constant press releases and news media attention. That doesn't serve the victim. Lawyers sometimes like to do press conferences, and there's a place for press conferences, certainly after a lawsuit. There's certainly a place for press conferences. But to protect the client while the lawsuit is going, I generally tend to avoid any sort of press that's going to subject my client to disclosure they don't want. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes the victim of abuse might want to come forward, and there are certainly victims of abuse, survivors of child sexual abuse who come forward and are heroic, and they stand up and say, look, this happened to me and this happened to a lot of people out there. And every one of them should come forward and not be shamed into silence, because this isn't your fault. This was
Yeah.
the fault of the perpetrator or of the institution that employed him.